Self-love. It's like everywhere these days, right? You hear it constantly. But for something so trendy, it kind of comes with, like, a lot of baggage. Are you talking about, just taking care of yourself, or are we heading into look at me, I'm amazing territory?
And that tension right there, that's exactly what makes St. Augustine so interesting to dive into. Forget the, feel-good Instagram quotes about self-love. Augustine spent decades, literally decades, wrestling with this idea. And trust me, his insights are anything but simple.
It's going to be good. Just a heads up to our listeners, we are getting philosophical today, and we're going straight to the source, Augustine's own writings, no interpretations, no summaries, just the good stuff.
Oh, and there's a ton of good stuff, believe me. What I find so fascinating about Augustine is, he doesn't just give you a simple answer on self-love. He actually identifies a bunch of different types of self-love, and some of them, they totally contradict each other.
Okay, so it's not as easy as just saying, all self-love is good or all self-love is bad.
Exactly. Augustine would say there's a huge difference between that, instinctual self-love we all have, if you touch a hot stove and you pull your hand back, that kind of thing.
Right, just basic self-preservation.
Exactly. Versus a more, I guess you'd call it a more ego-driven, prideful kind of self-love. And that second kind, that's the one he sees as a real problem. It's like turning away from what really matters.
So dodging that metaphorical or maybe literal hot stove?
Yeah.
That's just survival 101.
Yeah.
Even my cat does that.
And you know what? Augustine would totally agree with you. He even points out that even animals show this kind of self-preservation. It's totally natural. It's necessary. It's when self-love becomes all about me, me, me. Everyone else can just wait their turn. That's when things go off the rails.
And that's where things get super interesting because Augustine doesn't stop there. He doesn't just talk about self-love on its own. He connects it directly to that other big commandment, love your neighbor as yourself.
And that, my friend, is where things get really interesting and more than a little complicated. How are you supposed to love your neighbor with that same intensity, that same, way you love yourself? Doesn't quite add up, does it?
Right. I know I should be as compassionate and forgiving with others as I am with myself, but
yeah,
it's tough,
This is where Augustine makes a really subtle, but honestly really profound point. He suggests that how we love other people, it should actually mirror, the ideal way we'd love ourselves. Not the way we actually love ourselves, flaws and all, but a love that's, pure somehow. A love that's not based on ego, but on something bigger.
Okay, so not the I'm awesome self-love, but a more grounded kind. Where does that kind of self-love come from?
Augustine would say it comes from our love for God. He sees this beautiful he doesn't use this word, but I think of it as a love triangle between loving ourselves, loving other people, and loving, the source of all love, right?
Okay. Now you've got me intrigued, I have to admit. Tell me more about this love triangle.
So Augustine, he uses this, it's kind of a striking image. He talks about glue. Yeah, glue. He's describing how real love, it's like the glue that binds us all together. But we're not just talking about, Elmer's glue here, right? This is cosmic glue, the force that holds, everything together, the whole universe.
Okay, cosmic glue is definitely not something you hear every day. But I kind of like it. It gets at this idea that, we're not just these isolated beings just bouncing off each other, right?
Yeah.
We are actually, connected somehow by this, this love energy.
Exactly. And the thing is, this isn't just some abstract theological idea that Augustine throws around. It has real consequences for our lives, for how we treat each other. Because if we're all literally connected by this glue of love, then harming another person, it's basically the same as harming yourself.
Whoa. Okay, so Augustine is really taking this whole self-love thing and he's showing how it doesn't just stay with us. It has these ripple effects. It goes outward into our relationships, our communities, maybe even the entire world.
Exactly. He's saying, hey, pay attention. Your choices, your actions, they have an impact on this whole web of relationships that we're all a part of, whether we realize it or not. And get this, he actually offers a kind of roadmap, a guide for how we can navigate this whole interconnected web. He calls it the upward journey.
Ah, yes. The upward journey. Tell me more about that because it sounds pretty aspirational.
Oh, it definitely is. Augustine, he describes it like a ladder or climbing up, ascending. He says we all start out at this place where we're focused on worldly things, right? Possessions, status, those things that feel good in the moment but don't last. But the goal, the whole point, is to move beyond that, to cultivate a love for ourselves, but a love that's well, rooted in something deeper, something that actually lasts.
And that's where love for God comes in, right? We were talking about that love triangle earlier.
You got it. Augustine would say that true self-love, the kind that sticks, it has to be grounded in a love for God. But here's the thing. He's not saying that we have to be perfect or that we need to, earn God's love to get there.
Really?
Yeah.
Because honestly, I always thought Augustine was all about, striving for perfection, being super strict with yourself.
I know. It's a common misconception for sure. Augustine actually talks a lot about grace, this idea that God gives us this help, this gift that helps us on our upward journey. And we don't deserve it. We can't earn it. It's freely given.
So it's not about proving you're good enough, but it's more about accepting that help, this boost, from something bigger than us.
Exactly. He's basically saying, look, we can't reach that place of perfect love, not for ourselves, not for anyone else, all on our own. We need grace to get us there. We need that help.
Okay, that's a lot to think about. So just to recap, Augustine is saying that, yeah, we're supposed to love ourselves, but not in that, look at me narcissistic way. And then we also need to love other people, even when it's, really hard. And then on top of that, we also have to cultivate this love for God, while remembering that this love is a gift, something we can't just muscle our way into. Did I get all of that right?
You basically summed up centuries of Augustine's thought in 60 seconds. Yeah. He truly believed that when we open ourselves up to grace, when we let it change us, that's when real self-love, the good kind, becomes possible. And that transforms self-love. It allows us to really love other people. I mean, truly love them, and to experience, the infinite love of God, which he believed was the source of real joy, real fulfillment.
Okay, I have to say that sounds like a pretty amazing cycle. Mm-hmm. But how do we actually do that? Practically speaking, how do we go from being so focused on ourselves, our own little worlds, to connecting with something so much bigger, so much more transcendent?
That is the million-dollar question. And this is where Augustine's idea of conversion comes in. He believed that for most of us, it takes this fundamental shift, this turning away from those self-centered desires, the me first mentality. And then it's this turning towards, something else, something higher towards God. But, and this is important, Augustine doesn't see conversion as a one and done kind of deal. He says it's this ongoing process, something you practice every single day. It's about trying to make your will line up with God's will.
So less about achieving some kind of perfect selflessness, more about just constantly striving, constantly trying to get back to this, this higher purpose, this bigger picture that Augustine talks about.
You got it. And that's actually where things start to get really practical, because Augustine, he doesn't just leave us hanging with all these lofty ideas and then say, good luck with that. He actually gives us some concrete advice for how we can actually cultivate this kind of, this transformed self-love.
Okay, now this is what I'm talking about. Give us the, Augustine self-help plan. What did he suggest? Okay, no, seriously, don't leave me hanging. What's the secret? How do we actually do this? What's Augustine's secret recipe for finding that true transformed self-love?
Well, Augustine probably wouldn't call it a secret recipe or a quick fix. He'd probably say it's more a lifelong practice. But he definitely gives us some places to start. One of his biggest recommendations is, it's humility.
Humility, huh? Not exactly the first word that comes to mind when I think about self-love.
True. But Augustine, he sees humility as the foundation, the key ingredient. He'd say that when we're so focused on our ego, what we want, what we need, it's we become blind to everyone else around us. And ultimately, we even block ourselves off from God's love too. But humility, he says, that helps us step outside of ourselves a bit, to see ourselves as part of that bigger picture.
So it's not about thinking we're terrible people or anything. It's more about just thinking about ourselves a little less, making less of a big deal about me.
Yes, you got it. And when we do that, it frees us up, doesn't it? We're more present for other people. It's easier to be compassionate, more generous. It's all that energy we were putting into ourselves can actually flow outward to the people around us.
It's Augustine's telling us to look around and be hey, there's a whole world out here, and it doesn't revolve around me.
Exactly. And this actually connects to another big piece of Augustine's advice, self-awareness. Really taking the time to examine our motives, our desires, even our everyday actions. He wants us to constantly be checking in with ourselves, asking, okay, am I doing this because it's truly good for me and for others? Or am I just chasing some fleeting pleasure, some ego boost?
It's like a values check-in. Am I actually living in a way that lines up with the kind of person I want to be?
Yes, exactly. And All of this, it leads up to Augustine's, I think, most challenging piece of advice, and that's surrender.
Surrender. Okay, now that sounds kind of scary.
I know. It can sound intimidating, but Augustine, he'd say that surrendering isn't about giving up. It's about, like, letting go of the need to control everything, to have all the answers. We have this idea in our heads about what'll make us happy, right? But Augustine, he challenges us to surrender that limited understanding, to trust that, well, maybe there's a bigger plan. He believed that real fulfillment, like true deep down happiness, it comes when our will, our desires, they line up with God's will, which is at its core a will of love.
Surrender is definitely a tough one. It's like you're admitting that you don't have it all figured out.
Oh, absolutely. But you know what Augustine would say? He'd say it's actually incredibly freeing. Think about it. When we let go of that need to control everything, to be the boss of everything, it opens us up to a whole world of possibilities. We start to tap into a strength that's way beyond anything we could do on our own. A strength that comes from something much, much bigger than us.
So it's not about becoming passive or weak. It's about like tapping into a different kind of strength, one that's already there, just waiting for us to let go and let it in.
Yes, 100%. That's where the real transformation happens, the kind of transformation that Augustine is talking about. That's when self-love becomes less about, me and more about giving, about pouring ourselves out for others.
Wow. I mean, that's quite a journey we've been on. From dodging hot stoves to embracing humility and surrender. It's safe to say Augustine's vision of self-love is pretty different from the whole, treat yourself mentality you see everywhere today.
It definitely is. But I think that's what makes his ideas so powerful. Even all these centuries later, he's reminding us that real self-love, true self-love, it's not about indulging every little whim. It's about cultivating something much deeper, something that lasts, a love for ourselves that's rooted in something much greater than ourselves.
It's about recognizing that inherent dignity we all have as humans, as people created in the image of God, just like Augustine would say.
Exactly. And that recognition, it changes everything, doesn't it? It allows us to love ourselves and each other so much more fully, so much more authentically. It's like Augustine's giving us the key to finding that deep, lasting happiness, the kind that sticks with you, not those fleeting moments of, look at me.
So if our listeners take away just one thing from our deep dive into Augustine today, what do you hope it is? What would you say?
If I could give everyone listening one piece of advice straight from Augustine, it would be this. Take a good, hard look at your own heart. What are the things you're chasing after? Why? What are your true motives? And then ask yourself, what kind of self-love am I practicing? Is it the kind that leads to deeper connection, to a sense of purpose? Does it lead to genuine happiness, the kind that radiates outward? Or is it keeping me stuck?
Because for Augustine, it's not really about self-love at all, is it? It's about recognizing that we're a part of something so much bigger, something interconnected, and honestly, really beautiful. And our ability to love ourselves, it all comes back to that bigger love, a love that starts outside of ourselves.
Beautifully said. And you know what? That is a thought worth pondering.
It really is.
Yeah.
And with that thought, we'll let our listeners do just that. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into St. Augustine, who knew he had so much to say about self-love.